To know the beginning of a thing is to feel its weight echoing backward through time. And in that echo, one hears not just facts, but the tension between what was permitted and what was feared. We begin not with Gerbert, not yet. We begin with silence. Not the silence of peace, but the silence that falls over a continent when its memory dies. The 10th century in Europe was not a dark age in metaphor alone, it was a forgetting. The roads of Rome had crumbled, the aqueducts dried. The marble domes, once ringing with dialogue and discovery, now echoed only chants and warnings of hellfire. And in that silence, something else had vanished: curiosity. Europe, once a crucible of ideas stretching from Alexandria to Gaul, had become a continent of walls, castles, cloisters, crucifixes. Knowledge still existed, but it was buried, guarded by men who feared its touch. The church had become the keeper of light. But it also held the key to the dungeon, where unwanted truths were locked away. The scriptures were not questioned. The order of the stars, the motion of the heavens, the architecture of the cosmos, these were not subjects of debate, but of dogma. And this was by design. The death of the Roman Empire had left a vacuum, and the church had filled it, not just with sacraments, but with certainty. And in that certainty, there was no room for speculation, no room for inquiry, only obedience. But memory is a stubborn thing, and sometimes what is buried returns. In a stone monastery nestled among the highlands of Auvergne, remote, mist-cloaked, and surrounded by the silence of pine, a child was born. His name was Gerbert. No noble title, no prophetic birthmark, just a mind, and the restlessness that often comes with it. We know little of his mother, less of his father. Even the date of his birth is vague, somewhere between 945 and 950. But what we do know is this. Gerbert entered the Benedictine monastery of Aurillac as a boy, and very early he began asking the wrong questions. In a typical monastic education, boys were taught to read only one book, the Bible. They memorized its verses, copied its letters with ink and trembling hands, recited chants, practiced devotion through silence and silence through fear. But Gerbert's eyes wandered. He noticed that the light through the stained glass window changed not randomly, but in rhythm. He counted, he drew, he mapped shadows. He was not satisfied with prayers. He wanted to understand the pattern. One monk, centuries later, would describe him in a marginal note as the boy who measured the sun with his fingers. Of course, in those days, such behavior was not called brilliance. It was called dangerous, because to see patterns where doctrine had decreed mystery, that was already a kind of rebellion. But Gerbert was lucky. The abbot of Aurillac at the time, Raymond of Lavaux, was an unusual man, well-travelled, open-minded, and secretly sympathetic to ancient knowledge. He saw in Gerbert a fire that, if not fanned, would be extinguished. And so, a fateful opportunity arrived. Around the year 967, a visiting noble, Count Borel II of Barcelona, passed through Aurillac. He had come on pilgrimage, or so he claimed. Some say he was also scouting for talent, scholars, scribes, minds that could assist in the complex politics of Al-Andalus, the Muslim-controlled region of Iberia. Raymond introduced him to Gerbert. The boy was barely in his 20s. What happened in that conversation we do not know. But we know what followed. Count Borel invited Gerbert to accompany him south, to the court of Toledo and eventually Córdoba, where knowledge had not died, but blossomed. And with that invitation, Gerbert stepped out of the shrouded north and into the library of the stars. Córdoba in the 10th century was unlike anything the Christian world had to offer. While most of Europe still used Roman numerals and counted time in prayers, Córdoba had observatories, public libraries, mathematicians, doctors, and astronomers who debated Aristotle as easily as they recited the Quran. This was the world of Al-Andalus, where Islam, Judaism, and Christianity still coexisted uneasily, but where the flame of classical antiquity had never truly gone out. In Cordoba, Gerbert met scholars like Hasdai ibn Shaprut, the Jewish polymath and physician to the caliph. He studied under Muslim scientists who had translated the works of Ptolemy, Euclid, Archimedes, and even lost Babylonian star maps. He read Greek texts in Arabic translation. He learned spherical geometry. He encountered the decimal numeral system, a marvel then unknown to the Christian world. And he came into contact with zero. Yes, zero. A number so powerful, so transformative, that even centuries later, the Church would resist it. Zero was nothing, yet made possible the infinite. It threatened all that was fixed, all that was finite, and yet to Gerbert, it must have felt like revelation. He also saw instruments, real objects, crafted by hand, that mapped the movements of the stars and planets with precision, the astrolabe, the quadrant, and most notably, the armillary sphere. The first time he saw one, Gerbert is said to have gone silent for over an hour. He had spent years sketching the heavens by observation. Now, before him, was a brass construct of pure cosmic logic, a set of interlocking rings representing the equator, the ecliptic, the meridians, all rotating around a central Earth. It was not divine, it was mechanical, and it worked. This was not just knowledge, it was power. And power, as Gerbert would soon learn, has its own gravity. Years later, when he returned to Francia, Gerbert was no longer a simple monk. He was a man who had walked through Alexandria without leaving Spain, a mind trained in forbidden mathematics, a Christian who had seen how other faiths preserved what his own had tried to forget. He was not just a scholar, he was a carrier of blueprints, of methods, of numbers, of visions. And slowly, his reputation began to spread. In the court of Otto I, Holy Roman Emperor, Gerbert dazzled with his instruments. He built a copy of the armillary sphere. He demonstrated lunar phases with geometric models. He taught court nobility how to count using Arabic numerals, including zero. He explained that the stars moved not by miracle, but by pattern. That time could be tracked mechanically, not liturgically. That God, perhaps, was not violated by knowledge, but expressed through it. Not everyone agreed. Some saw him as a marvel. Others saw him as a threat. A bishop wrote, "The monk speaks as if nature were a book he alone may read. I fear he turns God into a wheel." But the Emperor Otto was enthralled. He elevated Gerbert, named him teacher to his son Otto II. The young prince, in turn, treated Gerbert more as philosopher than tutor. And when Otto II died, it was Otto III, Gerbert's former pupil, who would bring him to Rome and make him pope. The year was 999. Europe trembled. Not metaphorically, literally. Earthquakes had struck the Alps. Comets were seen in the night sky. Famine and plague ravaged the countryside. Priests warned of judgment. The millennium would end in fire, they said. Christ would return. But in the Vatican, Gerbert, now Pope Sylvester II, prepared not for apocalypse, but architecture. He expanded the church's libraries. He supported scholars. He ordered new translations of old texts. And in secret, some say, he began building something, some kind of machine. Others say it was a chamber, part study, part laboratory, hidden beneath the Lateran Basilica, a place where he sketched equations not for salvation, but for stars. And in doing so, Sylvester did not just inherit Peter's throne, he inherited the oldest fear in Christendom, that a man might become a mirror to God, not through suffering, but through understanding. Faith that fears inquiry, Gerbert once wrote, has already died, but faith that welcomes the mind, that is the throne of heaven. These words were never canonized, but they were copied, secretly, quietly, in monasteries and margins, in the corners of texts where scribes were still allowed to think. They would survive, even when Gerbert would not. In every generation, there are those who carry torches into caverns not meant to be lit, and there are always others, standing in robes, ready to extinguish them in the name of order. Gerbert was now Sylvester, not just the man, the symbol. By the year 1000, he had become what no one expected, a pope not of miracles, but of machines. And to the old powers entrenched within the Church, that was an anomaly too dangerous to tolerate. To understand the storm that gathered around him, one must understand what he represented, not just as a mind, but as a mirror. He did not merely think differently, he exposed the limits of those who refused to think at all. The Church, by then, had not only seized political authority, but intellectual monopoly. Any cosmology, any metaphysics, any theory of nature that did not align with Scripture was not simply rejected, it was anathema, condemned, silenced. And here was a pope, seated on the throne of St. Peter, who believed that numbers revealed more about God than visions, who spoke of planetary orbits rather than angelic choirs, who calculated time with brass gears, not liturgical hours. It was unprecedented, and it was intolerable. In his first year as Pope, Sylvester II instituted reforms that sent quiet tremors through the hierarchy. He invited scholars from beyond the Alps to present at synods. He commissioned scribes to copy rare texts, some of which had been previously listed in the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Church's own list of forbidden works. Among them were fragments of Boethius, commentaries on Pythagorean harmony, and even obscure treatises from Syriac Christian astronomers long buried in Eastern monasteries. In one letter, preserved in a partial manuscript found in the Biblioteca Nazionale di Firenze, he writes, "We were given dominion over the garden not to crush its fruit beneath ritual, but to taste and map its sweetness." To the ears of reason, this was poetry. To the ears of doctrine, it was heresy. And so, the resistance began, not with swords, but with whispers. The Curia Romana, the Church's secretive inner chamber of cardinals and power brokers, had long protected the traditional structure of knowledge, Scripture at the top, saints below, scholars last. Gerbert, now Sylvester, had inverted the pyramid, and those at the top began to push back. It started with Cardinal Benedictus, a man of rigid faith, icy presence, and impeccable political instinct. He saw in Sylvester not a heretic, but something worse, an innovator. Innovators threaten the past, not by denying it, but by replacing it. Under Benedictus, a subtle but powerful campaign unfolded. Sylvester's past in Islamic Spain was brought into public conversation. Monks circulated anonymous epistles referring to the Pope as Gerbert the Moor. A fabricated tale appeared in 3 monasteries, that in Córdoba, Gerbert had been initiated into a sect of stargazers who worshipped Saturn, and that he had exchanged his baptism for the secrets of the heavens. It was false, but truth rarely stops fear. Another attack came through what would today be called mimetic warfare. Sermons were delivered in the provinces, accusing the Pope of building a head that speaks when the moon is new. To illiterate peasants, this sounded like necromancy. To literate priests, it sounded like treason. The artifact in question, the so-called bustuarium, was, in fact, an automaton Gerbert had designed years earlier. A brass head containing gears, levers, and a set of weighted answers, yes or no, activated by simple mechanical triggers. It was a demonstration of physical logic, not magic, but the nuance was lost. In a continent already primed by apocalypse hysteria, even suggestion became reality. Sylvester responded not with anger, but with creation. In the summer of 1001, he summoned a group of scribes and artisans to what he called the Chamber of Reflection, a small vaulted room beneath the Lateran Palace. There, according to a lost fragment discovered in the 17th century, he unveiled a planetary clock, a device of rotating rings driven by counterweights that tracked the positions of the visible planets over the course of a year. A monk from Mainz, who briefly described the chamber in a side note to a liturgical diary, wrote, "The Pope's room had no crucifix, only the heavens etched in copper. The air smelled not of incense, but of metal and oil." What did this mean? To some, it meant nothing. To others, it meant too much. Because in a world where only divine mystery was allowed to govern the heavens, To predict them with mechanics was to trespass upon the sacred. It was intellectual trespassing, a quiet crime, unpunishable. That autumn, a series of minor crises began to unfold. A storm collapsed part of the basilica roof. A lunar eclipse frightened the population of Rome. 2 crops failed in Tuscany. These were common occurrences. But now they were framed differently. Omens, said Benedictus. Punishment, said the clergy. Proof, whispered the fearful, that the man on Peter's throne had abandoned God for the stars. Sylvester tried to respond with calm. In a sermon recorded by a Flemish bishop, he spoke, "When the moon darkens, it is not a curse, it is shadow. When the roof falls, it is not wrath, it is weakness. Do not fear the patterns of nature. Fear only that you do not see them." But they would not listen. The Curia had already made their decision. By late 1002, letters were circulating between French and German monasteries, referring to Sylvester II only by his birth name, Gerbert, as if his papacy were a mistake to be corrected. 2 emissaries sent to Constantinople under his name were recalled without explanation. His request to fund a new school of astronomy in Ravenna was denied by the treasury. And on the Feast of the Nativity, it is said that Cardinal Benedictus himself refused to take communion from the Pope's hand. This was open defiance. But Sylvester did not fight. Instead, he retreated further into his private study. A chamber none were allowed to enter. A chamber, according to a later legend, that did not cast a shadow by candlelight. It is here that the story begins to blur, fact and fable intertwining. Some say Sylvester continued building his models in secret, that he was attempting to construct a celestial map predicting not only eclipses, but earthquakes and social revolutions. That he believed history, too, followed a pattern, a kind of hidden orbit. Others claim he began work on a codex, a book meant for future eyes, written in cipher, describing what he called the clockwork of the divine. One monk, centuries later, described seeing a page from this codex. It bore only a diagram, a circle within a circle, surrounding a small black dot. Beneath it, the words, et in medio, nihil, and in the center, nothing. 0. Again, 0. The number that contains everything and yet terrifies still. As winter deepened, Sylvester's health began to fade, or so the record claims. But there are no descriptions of illness, no record of physician visits, only the growing silence from the Lateran, and then, one day, he stopped appearing. Mass was led by others, audiences were cancelled, his voice vanished from Rome, and yet he was not dead. Not yet. What happened in those final weeks would become one of the Vatican's most enduring secrets, and one of its deepest fears. A man does not vanish by absence alone. He disappears when memory no longer dares to speak his name. It is the year 1003. Rome moves beneath low grey skies, its streets quieter than usual. In the Lateran Palace, the papal household begins to thin. Couriers arrive less frequently. The great bell of St. John Lateran tolls, not with triumph, but with apprehension. And in the innermost chamber, past 3 doors, guarded not by soldiers, but by silence, Sylvester II sits alone. Or so they say. No official document records the final month of his life. No physician testifies. No bishop is summoned to hear his last confession. There is only absence. Those closest to him, scribes, attendants, even old students, are dismissed. Orders arrive from within, written in his own hand, always brief. No one is to enter. No mass, no incense. Preserve silence. Something has changed. According to a letter written a decade later by a monk named Ælfric of Canterbury, who had once studied under Gerbert, Sylvester had begun a final project, one that would not be finished. Ælfric describes a book left open on a stone pedestal, written in alternating lines of Latin, Arabic, and a third unknown script. At the center of its first page was a diagram unlike any the monk had seen, a ring of planets encircling a dark star. A sequence of numbers spiraling inward, 1, 2, 4, 8, 16. A line beneath translated, "Time repeats not in circles, but in echoes." Was this philosophy, or prophecy, or the early mathematics of something far stranger? Some believe Gerbert was attempting to encode a theory of time itself, based on celestial movements, historical patterns, and cycles of decay and revelation. If so, the implications were heretical, because if history could be predicted, so could revelation. In his final week, it is said that Sylvester sent only one message. A sealed letter addressed not to the curia nor the clergy, but to his old student, now Holy Roman Emperor, Otto III. No one knows if it reached him. But in 1682, during a restoration of the monastery of Fulda, a tattered envelope was discovered inside the hollow of a wooden cross. It bore a broken seal and the initials G.P., Gerbertus Papa. Inside, the letter, 4 pages, damaged, scorched at the corners. The first lines read, "You will not understand this now, nor should you. But I must leave behind what cannot yet be spoken." He writes of a mechanism, a construct of brass and burden, unfinished, buried beneath stone. Of a scroll, written in mirrored script, hidden within the third arch of the chapel. He warns of a reckoning not of wrath, but of recursion. But it is the final line that has haunted historians for centuries. If they erase me, find the silence. It remembers everything. Sylvester II died on May 12, 1003, or so we are told. No eyewitness. No autopsy. No death mask, as was common in the papal tradition. His death was announced by Cardinal Benedictus, the very man who had sought his undoing. And within hours, the chamber of reflection, the workshop beneath the Lateran, was sealed in mortar. 3 scribes who had copied his documents were removed from their posts. 1 disappeared. 2 joined distant monasteries and never spoke of Rome again. An account found in a 13th century codex from Lyon describes an unnamed artisan being silenced beneath the altar, his tongue cut out so that he could not describe the stars to peasants. Was this punishment or precaution? The funeral of Sylvester II was closed to the public. A papal bull was issued declaring the ceremony sufficient without spectacle. His body was not buried in St. Peter's Basilica, as was tradition. Instead, he was interred at San Giovanni, in Laterano, in an unmarked crypt beneath the nave. No monument, no epitaph. Only later would a single line be carved into stone, faint and off-center. Gerbert, born in questions, buried in silence. Some claim this inscription was added centuries later. Others insist it appeared overnight, without chisel or hand. A legend grew that his tomb weeps whenever a pope lies, and that on certain nights it vibrates, tick, 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 like a clock with no source. The Vatican has never confirmed this. They have never denied it. In the years that followed, his name was carefully removed from clerical records. Only the bare minimum remained. Sylvester II, reign 9999-1003. Predecessor, Gregory V. Successor, John 17th. No mention of reforms, no list of writings, no acknowledgement of his teachings. In Vatican inventories, his possessions are listed under the heading Gerbertus, non probatus. Gerbert, not approved. Even in death, his work was denied entry. But as with all things buried, fragments rise. In 1457, an archivist in Krakow uncovered a brass sphere, hollow, with etched concentric rings, one labelled Sol, another Luna, and 5 others marked with unfamiliar characters. He brought it to a local astronomer who observed, "The device mimics the sky, but it is older than any map I know." The artifact disappeared within months. In 1611, a Jesuit scholar claimed to find a set of folios attributed to Sylvester II, stored in the monastery of St. Denis. They included star charts, musical notations, and something resembling binary sequences. He submitted them to Rome. He was excommunicated 2 weeks later. The folios were never seen again. Even into the modern era, the Vatican has not ceased its quiet custody of the unknown. In 1972, a low-level archivist, known only as FL, filed an internal memorandum requesting access to subterranean vault GV12, designated Gerbert. The request was denied. He was transferred to a monastery in Sardinia. In 1998, a leaked internal document appeared online briefly, referencing Codex Gerbertinus, a text of unknown authorship containing mechanical descriptions, eschatological projections, and non-canonical cosmology. The file was deleted within 12 hours. Its content remains speculation, but its name, Codex Gerbertinus, echoes a possibility that refuses to die. So what did Sylvester II leave behind? Did he unlock a piece of the divine, hidden not in faith, but in frequency? Did he map the music of the spheres? Did he write a theory of time so dangerous it had to be buried with him? Or did he simply live too soon in a world unready for the convergence of mind and mystery? No one can say for certain, but the silence remains, and silence remembers everything. Erasure is never just forgetting. It is a rewriting of what must not be remembered, because remembering would demand accountability. The centuries after Sylvester II's death were not kind to his legacy. What had once been admiration turned to whispers. What had once been whispers turned to warnings, and eventually to fable. By the 11th century, less than 50 years after his death, Gerbert of Aurillac was no longer remembered as a reforming pope or a scholar of astronomy, or a man who had tried to rebuild the bridge between faith and reason. He had become, instead, a sorcerer pope. The Church, deliberately or passively, allowed the legends to grow. Perhaps it was easier to make a myth of him than to explain what had truly been buried, and so the stories began. In one version, still told in parts of southern France, Gerbert was said to have crafted a pact with a demon in the caves beneath the Pyrenees. The tale goes, he descended, seeking the secrets of time, and returned with a head made of bronze which spoke truths only under the light of Saturn. The head, they say, would answer only yes or no. But one day, when asked if Gerbert would die before he celebrated Mass in Jerusalem, it said, no. Relieved, Gerbert continued his life. Years later, he celebrated Mass in a small Roman chapel, unaware that the name of the place had recently been changed to Jerusalem in honor of a relic brought from the East. He collapsed that very day. The bronze head never spoke again. It is a compelling tale. It is also almost certainly fabricated. But stories like this serve a function. They do not inform, they contain. They take a man who was dangerous not for his magic, but for his mind, and recast him as a cautionary tale. Better to label him an alchemist than a mathematician. Better to fear him as a wizard than to acknowledge him as a scientist. Because if he were only a magician, then the world he saw, a world of order, calculation, and structure, could remain safely locked behind the veil of fantasy. The 12th and 13th centuries saw an expansion of universities in Paris, Oxford, Bologna. Paradoxically, it was during this rebirth of learning that Gerbert was most thoroughly forgotten. His name appears only in footnotes, often misattributed. His instruments vanish from inventories. His letters are found unsigned or rewritten under the names of more acceptable figures. In one case, a surviving planetary model once credited to Gerbert was relabeled in the 15th century as Constructum per Fra Thomas Aquinas, despite Aquinas having died 2 centuries too early. Why this deliberate obfuscation? Because the memory of Sylvester II raised uncomfortable questions. If he had been right about the stars, about the structure of time, about the harmony between faith and reason, then what did it say about those who had condemned him by silence? It was easier to forget than to confront, but forgetting is never perfect, and memory, like time, loops back upon itself. In 1273, a Cistercian monk named Brother Martin, copying manuscripts in a scriptorium near Cologne, discovered a loose page tucked within a worn copy of Isidore of Seville's Etymologiae. The page contained a list of planetary conjunctions calculated with remarkable precision. At the bottom, in a fine, nearly erased hand, Gerbertus Facit. Gerbert made this. The monk, intrigued, brought it to his abbot. The page was burned. Brother Martin was reassigned. But before he left, he copied one sentence into the inside cover of his Psalter. That which is burned by fear returns in fire. In the 14th century, stories of Gerbert evolved again. Now he was not just a sorcerer, but the last of the hidden sages. A text known as De Magno Libro, the Great Book, appeared in the hands of an Italian alchemist named Pietro de Ravenna. Within it were references to a pope of geometry who had unlocked the circle within the circle and who left behind a map not of Earth, but of knowledge itself. The book was banned. Copies vanished. Ravenna was arrested for heresy. His trial transcript refers repeatedly to a Gerbertian diagram, a symbolic system believed to represent the recursive structure of time. It resembled a clock, but one that pointed not to the hours of day, but to cycles of civilization: fall, rise, fall. Later still, in the 16th century, during the rise of Renaissance humanism, Gerbert's name flickered once again in scholarly circles. Some called him a proto-humanist, others a scientist trapped in an age of superstition. In 1551, an anonymous manuscript titled Tabula Sylvestrina surfaced briefly in Venice. It contained a set of tables, eclipses, equinoxes, planetary alignments, far more advanced than any public text of the time. The manuscript was seized by the Inquisition. Its fate is unknown. A brief note survives in the personal diary of the Doge's astrologer who had seen the book. If these tables are true, then the sky has been repeating itself longer than the church has drawn breath. But the most disturbing echo of Gerbert came not from books, but from stone. In 1608, while renovating the Basilica of St. John Lateran, workers uncovered a sealed room behind the main altar. Inside, nothing but dust, broken shelves, and a single piece of scorched parchment. On it, a drawing, an orb, surrounded by 7 concentric rings. Within it, a phrase in Latin, et tempora redeunt, and the times return. The parchment was sent to Rome, and then disappeared. The room was resealed. No further comment was made. Why this persistent fear? Why this ongoing effort, not to destroy, but to bury? The answer may lie not in theology, but in something older, something deeper. Gerbert did not challenge the church with blasphemy. He challenged it with structure. He proposed that even the sacred could be systematized, that divine will might be expressed in mathematics, in orbits, in harmonic resonance, that even revelation had a rhythm. This is not merely intellectual, it is existential. Because if God can be known not through mystery but through pattern, then who holds the power? Not priests, but those who can read the pattern. And that was Gerbert's crime. He did not destroy the church, a 19th century Jesuit once wrote. He made it unnecessary. Of course, that's not true. Gerbert never wanted to dismantle belief. He wanted to redeem it through understanding. He believed that faith and reason were not enemies, but twins long separated. But history is not kind to mediators. It forgets them, because their existence proves the divide was never necessary to begin with. Time is not linear in places where memory is trapped in objects. It coils in brass. It sleeps in stone. It waits, not for permission, but for attention. While the pages bearing his thoughts were burned and the sermons he gave distorted, there remained objects, silent artifacts that, though stripped of name, refused to vanish. Unlike myth, a mechanism cannot lie. It functions, or it does not. And long after Gerbert was dead, his machines lived on. The earliest trace appeared in an abbey in Reichenau, southern Germany. Sometime in the late 11th century, a new abbot arrived, learned, cautious, and deeply suspicious of what he found hidden in the deepest vault of the monastery. A spherical device, ringed and delicate, made of copper and inlaid with tiny star engravings. At first mistaken for a religious relic, it was brought before the abbot. Upon closer inspection, It was clear. This was no chalice, no symbol. It was a map, a functional model of the heavens, possibly a recreation of Gerbert's armillary sphere. One monk recorded, "It turned with pressure from a single finger. The rings sang faintly when moved, like crystal wind." The abbot ordered it melted down. It vanished before that could happen. A similar object, though simpler, was catalogued in a 13th century inventory of the Abbey of St. Gall. Described only as an orb of moving parts, it was attributed to an unknown maker. Accompanying it were diagrams, ratios of lunar phases, a chart tracking eclipses over a 19-year cycle, and a calendar based on a non-Julian structure. In the margins, the glyph of a square within a circle, a symbol later associated with manuscripts rumoured to descend from Sylvester's lost codex. But the most disturbing relic would not be an instrument. It would be a slab of stone. In 1422, in the city of Avignon, masons restoring a collapsed crypt beneath a Franciscan chapel uncovered a carved black tablet, no more than half a metre across. At its centre, an engraving of a stylized clock, but with no numbers. Only phases of the moon and the names of 7 ancient cities: Jerusalem, Alexandria, Cordoba, Rome, Constantinople, Antioch, and Aurillac, the final city, his birthplace. Around the edge, an inscription, half erased by age, half scorched: Chronometron mundi, iterum vocabitur. The world clock, it shall speak again. The artifact was brought to a local bishop, who ordered it sealed in the cathedral vault. A decade later, it disappeared in a fire. Only a charcoal sketch remains, found centuries later in the notebook of a French antiquarian, whose name appears on a Vatican index of dangerous collectors. The motif of clocks, time measured not by divinity, but by design, continued to appear in strange places. In 1589, a clockmaker in Prague built what he called the silent dial, a timepiece with a rotating center that only completed its cycle every 33 years. It contained no hour markings. Instead, the months were aligned with zodiac signs, and a tiny copper figure, a man robed in stars, stood at the center, unmoving. The craftsman, Jan Horak, claimed he was inspired by the fragments of a pope's vision, buried in a book with no name. When the Inquisition questioned him, he refused to name the source. He was never seen again. The clock still exists. It rests in the cellar of a private collection, ticking faintly, towards something no one understands. In 1891, an archaeologist named Emilio Battaglia discovered a sealed chamber beneath San Giovanni in Laterano during a structural inspection. Inside, fragments of brass gears, shattered lenses, and a set of thin lead sheets etched with overlapping diagrams, celestial, mechanical, and musical. He brought 2 sheets to the surface. On one was an inscription, Harmonium mundi secundum ordinum occultum. The harmony of the world, according to the hidden order. The Vatican intervened within days. The chamber was resealed under the pretext of structural instability. Battaglia was discredited and dismissed from the University of Bologna. He died in obscurity. His personal notes mention one final discovery, a scrap of parchment pinned to a collapsed beam, bearing only 3 words in Latin, et in arcano, and in secret. There is, too, the matter of the tomb. For centuries, it was assumed Gerbert's grave in the Lateran Basilica was unmarked, inaccessible, and forgotten. But in 1645, during the pontificate of Innocent X, a minor earthquake cracked part of the basilica floor near the choir section. Within the crack, a cavity. Within the cavity, a coffin. Wooden, reinforced with bronze bands, unusual for the time. No name. Only a symbol, a triangle nested inside a circle, flanked by 4 stars. The workers who discovered it reported an overpowering scent of oil and copper. The Vatican ordered the crack repaired overnight. No public announcement was made. And yet, a 17th century Jesuit diary, found in a Jesuit archive in Bruges records. They have found the man of the clock, He sleeps where no bells are rung. But not all evidence is physical. Some exists in sound. In 1977, a Vatican archivist named Paolo Di Neri digitized a series of ancient Gregorian chants. While cleaning the recordings, he noticed something strange on one of the reels, an ultrasonic frequency, not part of the original chant. When slowed down and modulated, it produced a rhythmic ticking, 32 beats per minute. Overlaying the signal with a star chart, Di Neri realized the rhythm matched the synodic period of Mercury, a planet Gerbert had studied extensively. He submitted his findings to the Vatican. 2 days later, his access was revoked. The tapes were lost. Di Neri resigned. In his final letter to a colleague, he wrote, "He left more than machines. He left a resonance, a system still pulsing beneath Rome, buried in gears we no longer recognize." Perhaps the most haunting possibility is this, that Gerbert's machines were not just observational, not just symbolic, but predictive. A codex found in fragments among the ruins of a monastery in Leon, Spain, contains what appears to be a timeline, a repeating pattern of upheaval and peace, religious authority and collapse, innovation and suppression. At its center, the date 1003, marked with the glyph of a wheel. Then a blank. Then a line pointing forward with the note, "The silence begins." Could it be that Sylvester II had seen the pattern? That he understood history not as a narrative, but as a waveform, a spiral of recurrence, not progress? And if so, what happens when the silence ends? They buried the man, but they forgot to stop the ticking. Every age has its vault. Every vault has its guardian. And every guardian knows some knowledge must not be destroyed, only delayed. Even as the physical remains of Gerbert's work were hidden, melted, or mislabeled, there remained another structure, a more elusive, more enduring edifice, the structure of fear. Because those who tried to preserve his legacy did so not openly, but in code. Across centuries, clues emerge, not in declarations, but in marginalia, not in doctrine, but in symbol. What survived was not the content of his mind, but the geometry of his thought. And it is in these symbols, scattered across illuminated manuscripts, chapel carvings, forgotten pages of old codices, that the real mystery unfolds. In a 14th century psalter found in Lyon, a monk had traced a curious image into the corner of a page. A 7-pointed star enclosing a circle, pierced by a diagonal line. The caption, in Greek, tonos ton chronon, the tension of time. Scholars have long debated its meaning, but among certain esoteric circles, this was recognized as one of the glyphs of Gerbert, a visual language said to encode the relationships between astronomical cycles, spiritual states, and historical phases. In Venice, a map dated to 1479 contains, hidden in its border, a pattern of interlocking spirals, each terminating in a 0 point. The map itself is mundane, land, sea, port names. But those spirals, they mirror the orbital resonance of the Moon, Venus, and Earth, a resonance first accurately described only centuries later. How did it get there, and who signed the map? No one. But in the lower right corner, almost invisible, SG, Sylvester, Gerbert, a possibility, nothing more. And yet, how often do such coincidences repeat before they cease to be accidents? In the 17th century, a little-known society of scholars and mystics in Prague called Ordo Vocis Arcanae, the Order of the Hidden Voice, produced a series of manuscripts known as Vitae Silentium. These texts explored forgotten theological systems, Gnostic fragments, and experimental mathematics. In Volume 3, the name Gerbertus appears 34 times. He is referred to not as a pope, but as the architect of silence. One passage reads, "He did not teach what he knew, he encoded it into recurrence. The wheel of years, the frequency of turning, when the world aligns again, his page will be readable." Some believed this meant Sylvester had buried his insights in a pattern of time, like a clock that unlocks itself only at the right moment. Others claimed the phrase referred to a vibrational principle, that his ideas could only be heard or comprehended when civilization reached the right intellectual frequency. Of course, such speculation was easy to dismiss. Until similar concepts began appearing in the writings of Leibniz, then Kepler, then Goethe. None mentioned Sylvester II directly, but echoes of his structure, geometric metaphysics, time as resonance, spiritual mechanics began seeping into modernity, not as doctrine, but as intuition. And then there is the Vatican itself. For all its denials, all its silence, the very architecture of the Lateran Basilica betrays something stranger. In 1953, a group of preservationists conducted a deep imaging study of the basilica's foundation using ground-penetrating radar. They discovered 2 sealed rooms, perfectly symmetrical, beneath the north transept. No entries, no ventilation, no record. But one room contained, according to the scan, a metallic object of circular composition, roughly 1.8 meters wide. The second, a series of vertical slabs, equidistantly spaced. A priest on the team quietly copied one detail from the scan, a small engraved plate near the object. The letters, GV0, Gerbertus, Vatican, 0. The priest submitted the report. 3 days later, the Vatican declared the site unstable and ordered no further investigation. The report has never been published. The original scans, lost. But what does this all mean? Are these just shadows, artifacts of a mind long mythologized? Or is there a design, not in the heavens, but in the suppression itself? The theory now gaining traction among certain scholars and archivists is not simply that Gerbert was forgotten, but that he intended to be. What if he knew his work could not survive in his own time? What if he embedded his ideas, not in text, but in timing? This is the essence of what some now call the Gerbertian hypothesis, the idea that the Pope's greatest invention was not the mechanical head or the armillary sphere, but a self-revealing system, a map, a pattern, a mechanism, built not to be seen in his own lifetime, but to unfold when civilization reached a certain threshold, a kind of spiritual encryption, which leads to a more haunting question. What if we are now approaching that threshold? In the year 2000, 1 millennium after Sylvester's death, a peculiar incident occurred. During a midnight mass in San Giovanni in Laterano, the choir ceased mid-chant when the floor beneath the altar vibrated once, just once, no quake. No aftershock, nothing broke, but a nun stationed near the sacristy reported a faint ticking, a sound not from the organ, nor from any clock in the cathedral. Her description? Like a heartbeat made of brass. The Vatican released no statement, but the following week, access to the crypt beneath the basilica was quietly restricted. A new plaque was added to the altar. It reads, "Let the time be as it is, and let the silence guard what remains." They did not burn his words. They buried his rhythm. To follow truth is to trace the path of those who vanished. And if you listen carefully, not with ears but with pattern, you might hear the footsteps still echoing beneath stone and secrecy. It is the 21st century now, and still we whisper. Still we search, not for the relics, not even the man, but for the question that has never been answered. Why did they bury the clock? In 2009, an independent researcher named Dr. Alina Moravec, a historian of medieval cosmology at Charles University in Prague, began investigating a pattern of recurring diagrams found across Europe. Images with no author, no date, but unmistakable coherence. The same 7-point star, surrounded by planetary glyphs. The same spiral calendar, ending abruptly in the year 1003. The same phrase, etched into wood, copied into vellum, even sewn into the lining of a bishop's stole in Krakow. Et tempora redeunt, and the times return. At first, Moravec believed she was chasing a symbol absorbed from Hermetic texts or apocryphal traditions. But the deeper she went, the clearer it became. This was a system, not a religion, not a cult, but a coded inheritance, passed from scribe to monk, from margin to icon, from relic to resonance. Its center, Gerbert, or at least what he set in motion. Her research led her to Rome, where, under academic pretense, she requested limited access to a portion of the Vatican Apostolic Archive, formerly known as the Archivum Secretum. The request was denied, twice. On her third application, she cited a rare manuscript once held in the Bavarian State Library, Codex Absonus 311, a 13th century compendium on cosmography that referenced the lost pope of the Eighth Turning. The Vatican replied, "This figure is apocryphal. No such reference exists in our records." But days later, Moravec received a private email from a source identifying only as AV. The message was brief. "The figure is real. He is buried not under stone, but in rotation." Attached was a grainy image of an architectural drawing, dated 1926, of the Lateran Basilica. The blueprint showed a spiral staircase descending far below the public crypt. At its center, a chamber labeled GV12. No other copy of this drawing has ever been authenticated. And yet, Moravec disappeared from public view 6 months later. Her website went offline. Her thesis remained unpublished. A former colleague at the university would later say, "She told me that what Gerbert built was not a device, but a threshold, and thresholds are dangerous when approached without preparation." What might that mean? A threshold to what? To knowledge, to prophecy, or to something deeper, a revelation not of the heavens, but of ourselves. Because at the heart of Sylvester's vision was never domination, never miracle, never command. It was pattern. He saw the divine not in the exception, but in the recurrence. Not in the burning bush, but in the quiet logic behind why every bush burns under the right conditions. This is what made him dangerous. Not because he denied faith, but because he removed fear from it. He invited comprehension, and comprehension erodes control. That control is what built the historical firewall that still stands today. Search the Vatican's official biographies. Sylvester II is listed, 4 lines, no mention of his scientific contributions, no mention of his automata, no mention of his time in Cordoba, or the students he taught, or the diagrams he drew. A pope who reigned during one of the most pivotal transitions in Western history is reduced to a footnote, but history has seams, and the seams are fraying. In 2022, a Vatican archivist, under conditions of anonymity, shared a scanned image of a restricted catalogue index used only by internal curators. The index, handwritten, dated 1871, listed a category, Instruments and Annotations, Gerbertus Papalis, Item 7, Mechanica ad mensuram temporis, Rota non numerata, Mechanism for the measurement of time, unnumbered wheel. Item 14, Scriptura celestis, Lingua duplicata, heavenly writing, dual language. Item 21, Corpus silenti, fragmenta tantum, the body of silence, fragments only. Item 34, non exponere sine mandato, do not disclose without mandate. When asked if any of these items were ever displayed, the archivist simply wrote, "They were never meant for the eyes of the past, only for the mind of the future." You do not silence a man forever. You delay him, until your descendants learn to listen. What if Sylvester II was never defeated, only deferred? What if his vision, like the celestial models he built, was designed to complete its orbit, not in his lifetime, but in a future one? What if the clock was not just physical, but historical? If so, then the questions we must ask are not about him. They are about us. Are we in the time of reawakening? Has the mechanism begun to turn again? Have we unknowingly stepped into the alignment for which the silence was set? And most dangerously of all, what happens when the voice behind that silence returns? Suppression is not always the child of fear. Sometimes it is the cold product of design, by minds that understand what must not be known, not because it is false, but because it is too true. By now, the pieces begin to align. Not just the myths, not just the mechanisms, but the intentions. Gerbert, Pope Sylvester II, was not merely a scholar ahead of his time. He was a system disruptor in an age that survived by maintaining the illusion of permanence. To understand why he was buried, not just bodily, but intellectually, we must step back and ask, what was the Church protecting? In the year 1000, the Christian world stood at a precipice. 1,000 years after the birth of Christ, fear was currency. Plagues, comets, lunar eclipses, each interpreted as signs of judgment, the end of the world. And into that apocalyptic panic stepped a pope who refused to preach doom. Instead, he calculated orbits. He mapped solar cycles. He rewrote the calendar not to count down to destruction, but to reveal a larger pattern. This undermined everything, because it told people that truth was not delivered from heaven, but discovered through reason, that the universe was not chaos tamed by ritual, but harmony waiting to be decoded, that God, if he existed, was not hiding behind fire and thunder, but embedded in numbers, motion, and music. This was not heresy. This was liberation, and liberation is bad for business. The Vatican of Sylvester's time was not yet the modern structure we know today, but its foundations were laid. And those foundations were built not just on faith, but on intermediaries, priests, bishops, relics, sacraments, all of which required the people to go through the church in order to approach the divine. Sylvester offered a different route, one that bypassed clergy and creed, a direct path from mind to mystery. In modern terms, we might call it decentralization of spiritual authority. But in his time, it was sedition against the soul. So they sealed the vaults, they rewrote the records, they replaced his clock with a cross, and told the people never to look behind it. But patterns resist destruction. They re-emerge in music, in math, in machines, and in moments of crisis. In 2020, a minor scandal broke within the Vatican. A brief notice in La Repubblica reported that a group of Swiss guards had refused an internal transfer assignment due to what was described as psychological disturbance related to their post beneath the Lateran complex. Officially, the guards cited auditory hallucinations. Unofficially, a source later described their testimony. They heard ticking, but it wasn't from a clock. It was slow, hollow, not mechanical, more like breathing in metal. The Vatican dismissed the event. But in internal documents later leaked through an anonymous whistleblower, it was labelled Anomalous Acoustic Activity, Subterranean Sector GV12. Again, the same designation we've encountered before. Gerbert, Vatican, Chamber 12. So what lies beneath? Some speculate that Sylvester's devices were preserved, not destroyed, by those who understood their importance, even if they feared them. Others believe he designed his inventions to self-activate, triggered not by switches or wheels, but by timing, a celestial alignment, a historical convergence, a mental readiness in the collective psyche. This is why, perhaps, the ticking returns, not to count down to an end, but to signal a re-entry point. The idea that history itself is structured like an orbit, a cycle of forgetting and remembering. Fall, rise, fall. Silence, voice, silence. And Gerbert was the keystone in one of those cycles. The deeper implication? We are no longer in the age of forgetting. We are entering the age of remembering, and that remembering is not just about books, relics, or theories. It is about permission. The permission to look directly at the things we were told to look away from, to think in shapes, not dogmas, to find the divine not in the clouds, but in the geometry of the wind, the spiral of galaxies, the pulse of blood through a vein. Gerbert knew this, and he encoded it, not in commandments, but in cadence. They buried a pope, but what they feared was the pulse beneath him. If the Codex Gerbertinus truly exists, if the chamber beneath the Lateran still holds fragments of his work, if the ticking is real, then we must ask, who is listening now, and who is still trying to keep us deaf. Because the most dangerous truths are not the ones that challenge belief. They are the ones that eliminate the need to be told what to believe. Gerbert's world was not a place of destruction. It was a place of revelation. And perhaps, just perhaps, he built that world for us. The dead do not speak, but what they left behind might, if we know how to listen, not with ears, but with alignment. Imagine a device not built to move hands over numbers, but to move eras over silence. A clock that measures not seconds but recurrences, not time but thresholds. Was this the true purpose of Gerbert's machine? Not to show what hour it was, but to indicate when memory would return. In 2023, a group of interdisciplinary researchers operating under the name the Harmonic Index published a cryptic white paper that never saw academic circulation. Titled simply Phase Shift: Patterns in Suppressed Technocultures of the First Millennium, the paper analyzed strange correspondences between solar activity, geopolitical upheaval, and sudden accelerations in mathematical knowledge. Their model, based on wave harmonics, proposed that certain centuries behave as resonance chambers, where echoes of previous eras return not metaphorically, but structurally. Key among their findings was the recurrence of the year 1003, Gerbert's death, as a node in a repeating signal, 1003, 1603, 2203, a 600-year interval, a triple cycle, and we, now, are approaching its edge. They called this phenomenon the Gerbert loop. Most dismissed it as esoteric speculation. But one footnote caught attention. Archives beneath Lateran structure exhibit thermal irregularities every 600 years, recorded in marginalia of papal facility logs, 1610, 1004. Was the clock starting again? Thermal irregularities might mean nothing, but silence, when interrupted, is never meaningless. In early 2024, seismic sensors placed throughout Rome for unrelated geological research registered a subterranean vibration, localized directly beneath San Giovanni and Laterano. Not a tremor, a pulse, 3 minutes long, precisely 33 beats per minute, measured, mechanical, no tectonic explanation, no known construction below that depth. Official response? No comment. Unofficial theories? Countless. But in a monastery near Verona, a monk recorded in his private journal, "He stirs again, the silence has rhythm, the turning begins." The Vatican, of course, remains quiet, but some believe there are signs. In late 2023, a new internal directive circulated to restricted archivists, coded under the name Sub Voce GV12. The contents remain classified, but its language, leaked in part, includes the following phrases: prepare for non-linear correspondence, cross-check harmonic intervals in sacramental codices, align with temporal recurrence doctrine, see Gerbert annotations. Temporal, recurrence, doctrine. 3 words that have never shared a sentence in a Vatican document before. Something is shifting, and what once was buried as myth is being treated as protocol. What does it mean? Are we nearing the activation of a machine, or the re-emergence of an idea? Or worse, are we already inside the idea, and it's beginning to realize itself? Because if Gerbert's greatest invention was a system designed to remain dormant until its time came, then everything we've ignored, everything we've sealed behind stone, everything we've called heresy, magic, or coincidence, may begin to speak. And if it speaks, it will ask questions. Questions we are not prepared to answer. What if time is not a river, but a clock? What if the divine is not above us, but embedded in our ability to recognize the recurring? What if truth was never lost, only timed? And most dangerously, what if the voice that now awakens from silence is not Gerbert's, but ours? Because this is what it was always about. Not machinery, not politics, not even theology. It was about liberation, from imposed rhythm, from dictated belief, from inherited blindness. Gerbert's clock was not built to enslave us to time. It was built to remind us that we were always meant to know, to decode, to awaken, together. History is not a line, it is a wheel, and when the wheel turns, those who were buried rise, not in flesh, but in relevance. He is still there, not in tombs, not in statues, but in every unfinished diagram, in every recurrence, in every time someone asks, why did they fear him? And in the silence that follows, you hear the answer. We have traced his birth beneath Pyrenean skies. We have followed him through the burning light of Cordoba. We have stood beside him as he built models of the cosmos in quiet rooms. We have seen the rise of a mind unchained by creed. And we have seen the fall, not by blade, but by bureaucracy, by slow, systematic forgetting, the most efficient form of execution. Because when you destroy a man's memory, you do not just kill him, you erase the question he was. But some questions resist erasure. Like seeds under ash, they wait. And now, they bloom again, in the patterns of climate, in the shifts of consciousness, in the way more and more people begin to sense something, out of place, yet familiar, a pulse, a rhythm, a return. Sylvester II was called a sorcerer, a heretic, a danger, but perhaps those were just names applied by a world afraid to admit that he saw further than they could accept, that he remembered things they were told to forget, that he encoded the future into mechanisms, manuscripts, and myth, not to dominate it, but to preserve its possibility. And now, that possibility whispers again, through vibrations under stone, through forbidden glyphs rediscovered, through unexplainable synchronicities between stars, numbers, and thought. Through you, perhaps, right now, wondering why this story feels like something you've always known. So, we are left with not answers, but with the most honest conclusion history can offer. Unfinished questions. Let them linger. What did Gerbert truly build beneath Rome? And has it already awakened? Were his calculations for time or for timing? Is memory a thing we recover, or something that recovers us when the world is ready? And what else, buried under Vatican vaults, sealed in forgotten frequencies, hidden in the curves of time, has yet to re-emerge? We do not know, we cannot know, and perhaps we were never meant to until now. He measured the heavens not to glorify himself, but to teach us how to listen. He disappeared so that his return would not be of flesh, but of understanding. As you walk alone tonight, as the stars wheel quietly overhead, as the silence around you seems to hum almost imperceptibly, ask yourself, what else have we forgotten that still remembers us?